Please, Preston, I have nowhere else to go.
This is no longer your home, Maya.
3 weeks after I lost my daughter, my husband had 2 security guards escort me out of the $50 million mansion I'd called home for 6 years, while I was still healing, still barely able to stand for long without pain, still wearing the same soft, oversized sweater I'd been living in since the hospital. He didn't raise his voice. That was somehow the part that stayed with me longest. How calm Preston Ellison sounded, standing in our marble foyer, telling security to make sure I had whatever personal items were necessary, while I stood there holding a single duffel bag, grieving a child neither of us would ever get to raise. I want to tell you before anything else, that I'm not sharing this story for sympathy. I'm sharing it because 8 months later, the same man who had me walked out of my own home while I was still grieving ended up losing considerably more than a marriage, and I never once had to lift a finger to make that happen. Before I tell you exactly how that unfolded, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this story is worth staying for all the way through. Like this video if you believe grief should never be met with cruelty. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that some reckonings simply arrive on their own. And drop a comment below with the time and the city you're watching this from. I read every single one. And I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to who I was before that mansion, before that marriage, and before the loss that revealed exactly who my husband really was underneath 6 years of carefully maintained appearances. My name is Maya Ellison, and I grew up in a modest, close-knit household in Atlanta, Georgia, raised by parents who worked hard and loved harder, in a neighborhood where everybody genuinely knew everybody's business, for better and occasionally for worse. I met Preston Ellison when I was 26, working as an interior design consultant on a boutique hotel project his development firm was overseeing. He was charming in the specific way successful, image-conscious men often are, confident, generous with compliments, quick to make me feel like the most interesting person in any room we walked into together. We married 2 years later, and I moved into the world Preston had built for himself, a $50 million estate outside Atlanta, a social circle defined largely by wealth and appearance, a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of fairy tale most people assume comes with that kind of money. I want to be honest that even in those early years before everything that happened later, I noticed things about Preston that unsettled me in ways I didn't always let myself fully examine. His warmth could disappear instantly the moment something threatened his carefully maintained image. He cared, deeply, about how our life appeared to his business partners, to Atlanta society, to his own mother, whose approval he seemed to chase with an intensity that sometimes bordered on desperation. I told myself, for 6 years, that these were simply quirks of a driven, successful man, rather than early signs of something considerably more concerning about how he'd eventually treat me during the hardest moment of my entire life. We'd been trying to start a family for nearly 2 years before I finally got pregnant. A milestone that brought Preston a level of genuine excitement I hadn't seen from him in years. An excitement that, looking back now, I understand was tied at least as much to the image of fatherhood he'd been cultivating for his social circle, as it was to any deeper anticipation of actually raising a child. The pregnancy itself progressed smoothly for the first several months, filled with the ordinary joys and exhaustions most expectant parents experience. Nursery planning, name discussions, Preston proudly announcing our news to his business partners at a dinner I remember him treating almost like a professional achievement rather than a deeply personal one. I want to keep this next part brief, because it's not a part of my story I feel the need to relive in detail for anyone, including you watching this now. At 32 weeks, during a routine appointment, my doctor was unable to find a heartbeat. I delivered our daughter, whom we'd already named Aaliyah, stillborn, 2 days later. In a hospital room I don't need to describe further to convey the depth of what that loss meant to me. I will simply say this. Nothing before that moment and nothing since has taught me more about the specific, singular weight of grief than those first days after losing Aaliyah. And nothing taught me more about who my husband truly was than watching how he responded to that grief in the weeks that followed. I don't believe, even now, that Preston felt nothing when we lost Aaliyah. I believe, based on everything I witnessed in those first raw days, that he felt something real, something painful, that he simply had no genuine framework for processing in any way beyond the careful, controlled composure he'd spent his entire adult life cultivating for every other area of his existence. He returned to work 5 days after we lost her, a decision that stung deeply in the moment, though I told myself, generously, that perhaps work was simply how he needed to cope. He grew distant in our home, spending increasing hours at the office, coming home late, offering brief, clipped conversations rather than the kind of shared grieving I'd hoped, desperately, we might find our way toward together. What hurt considerably more than his distance was something that emerged gradually over the following 2 weeks, a specific, cold undercurrent in how he began speaking about the loss itself, as though some part of him had quietly decided, without ever saying so explicitly, that my body, my pregnancy, had somehow failed him personally, rather than understanding that we had both experienced a devastating loss neither of us caused or could have prevented. Dr. Ashford mentioned some pregnancies just don't take properly, Preston said to me, 12 days after we lost Aaliyah. A comment so casually devastating that I sat in stunned silence for a long moment before I could respond at all. Maybe we should look into whether there's an underlying issue before we try again. I remember staring at him, still moving carefully through my own physical recovery, still deep in a grief I could barely find language for. Hearing my husband reduce the loss of our daughter to a fixable issue, rather than the devastating tragedy we should have been grieving together. The argument that would ultimately end our marriage happened 3 weeks after we lost Aaliyah, on an evening when Preston came home late from what he described as an important dinner with investors, a description I later learned was only partially true. I confronted him, that evening, about the growing distance between us, about comments like the one regarding an underlying issue, about a coldness that had settled over our home that felt, to me, like an entirely separate loss layered directly on top of losing our daughter. I need you to actually grieve with me, Preston, I said, my voice breaking in a way I hadn't allowed it to in front of him since the hospital. I need you to stop treating this like a business problem to be solved, and start treating it like the loss it actually is. Preston's response revealed, in a single devastating conversation, exactly how deeply his own inability to process grief had curdled into something considerably uglier over those 3 weeks. You want to talk about grieving? He said, his voice rising in a way I'd rarely heard from him. I'm grieving the fact that everyone at that dinner tonight was tiptoeing around me, asking careful questions about how we're doing, looking at me with that specific pity I can't stand. I'm grieving the image of this family I'd built, Maya. The one that's supposed to include an heir, a beautiful home, a wife who... He stopped himself, though not soon enough for me to miss exactly what he'd been about to say. A wife who what, Preston? I asked, my own voice going dangerously quiet. A wife who could actually carry a pregnancy to term, he said. The words landing with a cruelty I don't think even he fully understood the weight of until they were already spoken aloud. What followed that devastating comment was an argument that escalated faster and further than anything in our 6 years of marriage, Preston's carefully maintained composure fully cracking for what felt like the first time I'd ever witnessed, revealing an anger and a coldness underneath that genuinely frightened me. He told me, in the middle of that argument, that he needed space, that he couldn't be in the house with me right now, that perhaps it would be better if I stayed somewhere else for a while so he could process everything. I want to be honest that I initially agreed, exhausted, grieving, simply wanting the immediate conflict to end, telling him I'd pack a bag and stay with my sister for a few days until we could both find calmer footing to actually talk. What happened next, roughly 40 minutes later, was not the calm, mutual space I'd agreed to. I was in our bedroom, moving slowly and carefully, still healing physically from delivery, packing a small bag with what I assumed would be a few days' worth of clothing, when I heard voices in our foyer, Preston's voice, along with 2 others I didn't immediately recognize. I came downstairs to find 2 security guards from Preston's development firm standing in our marble entryway, Preston beside them, his expression carefully composed once again, the raw anger from our earlier argument replaced by something colder, more controlled, considerably more frightening in its calm certainty. Maya, I've asked David and Marcus to help make sure you have everything you need to transition comfortably, he said, his voice even professional, as though he were discussing a business matter rather than removing his grieving wife from their home. I think it's best if this happens tonight, cleanly, rather than dragging out an uncomfortable transition. I stood in that marble foyer, still healing from delivering our stillborn daughter 3 weeks earlier, watching my husband arrange for security guards to oversee my removal from the home I'd lived in for 6 years. And I felt something inside me go very still, very quiet, in a way that surprised even me given how much emotion had been sitting just beneath the surface only minutes earlier. "Preston, I agreed to stay with my sister for a few days," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though I could feel my hands trembling slightly at my sides. "I don't understand why this needs security involved. I just want to make sure this goes smoothly," he said, a phrase I understood, even in that moment, as a thin, corporate euphemism for something considerably colder happening underneath it. One of the security guards, a man named Marcus who I'd interacted with pleasantly several times over the years at Preston's office events, looked visibly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding in front of him, though he said nothing to intervene, simply standing there, following instructions he'd clearly been given without being told the full context of what those instructions actually involved. I packed the rest of what I could manage in the following 20 minutes, security quietly present throughout, Preston remaining in his study rather than helping or even watching directly, as though removing himself physically from the scene somehow made his role in it less real. I left that house at just past 10 in the evening, 3 weeks after losing our daughter, driving myself to my sister's apartment with tears streaming down my face for the entire 20-minute drive, understanding, with a clarity I hadn't expected to find so quickly, that whatever I'd believed my marriage to be for 6 years had never actually existed in the way I'd wanted so badly to believe it did. The following months were, by any honest measure, some of the hardest of my entire life, grieving Aaliyah, grieving the sudden, brutal end of a 6-year marriage, and rebuilding an entire life essentially from scratch, all at once, while my body was still physically healing from delivery. My sister, Renee, and her husband opened their home to me without hesitation, giving me space to grieve fully, without the added pressure of navigating Preston's cold, image-conscious presence during a period when I desperately needed genuine warmth and understanding instead. I began working with a grief counselor who specialized specifically in pregnancy and infant loss, someone who helped me slowly, over many difficult months, find language for a grief that had felt, for a long time, too enormous to fully articulate. I connected, through a local support group she recommended, with other mothers who had experienced similar losses, finding a community of genuine understanding that Preston, even at his best moments during our marriage, had never quite managed to offer me. I also, during those months, worked with a family law attorney to formalize our divorce, a process complicated by the sheer scale of Preston's wealth, though considerably less contentious than I initially feared, given how thoroughly documented his own behavior during our final weeks together had become, through text messages, through witnesses like Marcus the security guard, through a pattern that, once laid out clearly, left little room for Preston's attorneys to construct a version of events flattering to their client. I rebuilt my interior design consulting business during those months too, taking on new clients independent of any connection to Preston's social circle, finding, gradually, a genuine professional satisfaction in work I'd let become secondary during 6 years of prioritizing Preston's career and image over my own. What Preston hadn't fully anticipated, in the weeks following that night in our marble foyer, was exactly how quickly and thoroughly the story of what he'd done would travel through the exact social and business circles he'd spent his entire adult life so carefully cultivating. Marcus, the security guard who'd stood uncomfortably present that night, mentioned the incident quietly to a colleague at Preston's firm, disturbed enough by what he'd witnessed that he apparently felt compelled to say something, even without any direct connection to me beyond that single uncomfortable evening. That mention traveled, as these things often do, through informal channels within Preston's own company, eventually reaching several of his business partners. Preston's mother, Diane Ellison, learned the full details roughly 6 weeks after that night, through a mutual friend rather than through any direct honesty from her own son. A friend who felt Diane deserved to understand exactly what her son had done rather than the vague, self-serving explanation Preston had apparently offered his own family about our sudden separation. Diane called me directly, several days after learning the truth, in conversation I hadn't expected and wasn't entirely certain, at first, how to receive. "Maya, I need you to know I am deeply, deeply ashamed of what my son did to you," she told me, her voice carrying a genuine grief I recognized immediately, having spent months now surrounded by people processing their own layers of loss. I raised him better than this. I don't know exactly where I failed, but I clearly failed somewhere, and I am so sorry for what you went through, both with Aaliyah and with how Preston treated you afterward. Preston's business partners, once the full story became known throughout Atlanta's development and investment circles, responded with a swiftness that surprised even me. Given how thoroughly Preston had spent years cultivating relationships built on carefully maintained appearances rather than any particularly deep personal loyalty. 2 of his 3 primary investment partners withdrew from an active development project within 2 months of the story spreading, citing publicly unrelated business reasons, though I understood, through Diane and a few remaining mutual connections, that the actual reason had considerably more to do with a growing discomfort about being associated with a man capable of the specific cruelty Preston had shown during his wife's darkest moment. His social standing suffered too, in the particular way that Atlanta's wealthy social circles can quietly, effectively exile someone without ever making the reason explicitly public. Dinner invitations grew sparse. Board positions he'd once held at 2 prominent charitable organizations quietly weren't renewed the following year. The specific image Preston had spent his entire adult life so carefully constructing began, piece by piece, to genuinely crumble, undone not by any deliberate campaign on my part, but simply by the accumulated weight of his own choices finally becoming visible to the people whose opinion he'd always cared about most. I want to be honest that I didn't orchestrate any of this. I never once reached out to his business partners, never contacted the charitable boards, never shared the story publicly beyond the private, honest conversations I had with my own therapist, my sister, and eventually, cautiously, Diane. What happened to Preston happened because the truth of his own behavior, once it existed outside the careful walls of our marriage, simply couldn't survive contact with people who valued basic human decency more than Preston had apparently ever counted on them to. Preston reached out to me directly for the first time 8 months after that night in our marble foyer. A phone call I almost didn't answer, given how thoroughly I'd worked, during those 8 months, to build a life and a peace that no longer required any space for him in it. I answered eventually, mostly out of a curiosity I didn't fully understand until I heard his voice, noticeably different from the confident, controlled tone I'd grown so used to throughout our marriage, carrying instead something that sounded, unmistakably, like genuine exhaustion and regret. "Maya, I know I have no right to expect you to talk to me," he said. "I just needed you to know that I understand now, more clearly than I think I've ever understood anything in my life, exactly what I did to you that night. I've lost my business partners. My mother barely speaks to me. I sit in that $50 million house most nights completely alone, and I finally understand that all of it, every single consequence, is something I did entirely to myself." I let him talk, mostly, listening carefully to a level of accountability I genuinely hadn't expected to hear from him, though I noticed, even through his apparent sincerity, that I felt something considerably more complicated than the vindication I might have once imagined feeling in this exact moment. "I'm not calling to ask you to come back," he continued, seeming to sense the question forming even before I could ask it. "I understand there's no version of that which would be fair to ask of you, after what I did. I just needed you to know that I see it now, clearly, the way I should have seen it that night instead of 8 months and an entire collapsed life later." I sat with Preston's apology for a long moment before responding, drawing on months of genuine grief work, months of learning to trust my own voice again after a marriage that had, I understood now with considerable clarity, slowly taught me to minimize my own needs in favor of his image and his comfort. "I believe that you understand it now, Preston," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I don't doubt that the last 8 months have been genuinely difficult for you, and I don't take pleasure in that, despite everything. But I need you to understand something too. You didn't just lose your business partners and your mother's trust because of one bad night. You lost them because that one night revealed something that had probably been true about you for considerably longer than either of us wanted to admit. A willingness to protect your own image and comfort over actually caring for the people who loved you, even in their most vulnerable, devastating moments." "I know," he said quietly. "I know that now. I lost our daughter 3 weeks before you had security walk me out of my own home. I continued. I have spent the 8 months since then learning how to grieve her properly, learning how to rebuild an entire life you tried to strip away from me in a single calculated evening, and learning, slowly, that I deserve considerably more than I ever let myself ask for during 6 years of marriage to you. I'm not interested in reconciliation, Preston, but I do hope genuinely that whatever you've learned in these 8 months means you treat whoever comes into your life next with the basic decency you weren't able to offer me when I needed it most. 2 years removed from that night in the marble foyer, I've rebuilt a life that looks considerably different from the one I once shared with Preston Ellison, built now on foundations of genuine community, professional independence, and a hard-won understanding of my own worth that I don't think I fully possessed during our 6 years of marriage. My interior design business has grown steadily since the divorce, no longer defined by any connection to Preston's social circle, built instead on my own genuine talent, and a client base that values my work for its own merit. I purchased a home of my own last year, considerably smaller than the $50 million estate I once lived in, but filled with a peace and genuine warmth that estate never fully managed to provide, regardless of its size or grandeur. I remain close with Diane, Preston's mother, an unexpected relationship that has continued to deepen in the years since that first difficult phone call, built now on a mutual respect neither of us anticipated finding on the other side of everything that happened. I still think of Aaliyah often, carrying her memory with me in ways that have evolved, gradually, from raw, overwhelming grief into something closer to a tender, permanent presence. A daughter I never got to raise, but whose brief life fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of my own, revealing, in the darkest possible way, exactly who my husband truly was, and exactly what I was actually capable of rebuilding once I finally stopped trying to preserve a marriage that had never deserved the full depth of my loyalty. I don't know exactly where Preston is today, beyond occasional updates I hear secondhand through Diane. Still working, still navigating what I understand to be a considerably more isolated life than the one he once so carefully constructed around image and appearance rather than genuine connection. I think, sometimes, about that marble foyer, about 2 security guards standing uncomfortably beside a husband who'd decided, in the depths of his own unprocessed grief, that removing his wife was easier than actually facing what they'd lost together. I understand now that the night I thought was the worst of my entire life was, in its own painful way, the exact beginning of a considerably better one. One built, finally, on my own terms, with my own strength, and with a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what I deserve that I don't think I ever would have found had that marriage simply continued on as it was.
Thanks for tuning in and watching to the end. Drop your comments below.